Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the channel. I'm Ben, and today I'm going to be doing the almost ultimate 1961 Les Paul SG video. Let's get into it. So if you've been watching my channel for a while now, you've probably heard me talk about SGs. I just love them. And that all started back in 2002 when I really wanted a Les Paul, and I think they were like 16 or 1700 bucks brand new. Imagine that. And that just put it right outside of the threshold for the no interest, no credit check payment plans that American Musical Supply was doing. So as I poked around on the website, I came across this, which is an SG Voodoo Special, SG Special Voodoo, and I think it was $900. Fit the criteria. A couple weeks later, it showed up at my house, and I basically played the heck out of it, and that started my lifelong obsession with SGs. Now, while I do love this SG Voodoo, I wanted to get back to the humble beginnings of the SG guitar and sort of look at the models from 1961. I call this the almost ultimate 1961 Les Paul SG video because I'm missing one crucial guitar, and that's an actual 1961 Les Paul. So the guitars I am going to use today are readily available as of mid-2024. Now first up we have a Gibson Custom Shop 1961 reissue Les Paul. Now since I don't actually have a real 1961, and I know that the Custom Shop prides themselves on historical accuracy, I'm pretty much going to use this model here to compare the other models to this one. And this isn't really a comparison of which one's better, which one's not, because we already know this is going to be the most authentic one, but it's going to be more of a comparison of what makes the other models a little bit different than this, because every model here is based on the 1961 Les Paul. Next up is a Gibson USA SG Standard 1961. Now Gibson makes no bones about this guitar being heavily influenced by the 1961 Les Paul, but stops short of calling it a reissue or a authentic recreation. Then we jump over to Gibson's more affordable line, Epiphone, and we start with this. This is Epiphone's Inspired by Gibson 1961 Les Paul SG Standard. Now Epiphone says this model is made in direct partnership with the Custom Shop. I've read various things about this partnership. I don't know what's true or not, but I'm going to assume that what it really comes down to is this model takes some cues maybe from the Gibson Custom Shop model, but obviously does not go as far as the Gibson model, and that's pretty evident with, just the headstock alone is obviously much different than that guitar or an original 1961 Gibson Les Paul, right? And lastly, we have this. This is the Epiphone SG Standard 61. Epiphone, of course, says this is inspired also by the 1961 Les Paul, which is why it is in this review, and I'm really curious to see how it stacks up against the other ones. Now, just to eliminate any confusion, because there's bound to be some when you're doing four guitars that are more or less called the same thing. So I'm just going to refer to this as the Custom Shop. I'm going to refer to this as the Gibson USA. For the Epiphones, I'm going to refer to this as the Inspired By, and I'm going to refer to this as the Budget Epiphone. Now, believe me, this has high potential to get really confusing, hopefully more for me and less for you after I'm done editing this video. Also, if you're wondering why one guitar is yellow and the others are red, well, the truth is I just wanted a TV yellow SG, and this seemed like a good time to do it. Now, one more thing that I want to point out is this guitar is the Les Paul. It is also the SG. It is the Les Paul SG. I'm probably just going to refer to it as an SG in this video, even though I know it's technically a Les Paul. Correct me in the comments if you want, even though I'm stating right now that I know what it is. Let's get into it. So Gibson pretty much has all the cost bases covered with this particular model of guitars. On my left here, the Budget Epiphone, this comes in at about $550, whereas the Inspired by Gibson Epiphone comes in at almost double that at $950. Now when we move over to the Gibson side of things, you've got the Gibson USA model, which comes in at about $2,000, and the Custom Shop model, which comes in at more than double that at $4,300. Now, if you've done some quick math, you've figured out that each guitar is about double the cost of the one before it throughout both product lines, Epiphone and Gibson, which means this Custom Shop is about 8 times the price of the Budget Epiphone. Now let's get into the cases, starting with the Budget Epiphone model. Well, of course, you don't get a case. It comes in a cardboard box and wrapped in some sort of foamy protective sleeve. As usual, you get the basic Epiphone case candy, which means an ad for the Gibson app, the Epiphone lifetime warranty card, stickers, 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 and lastly, a hang tag that says, "This guitar has Gibson strings." Despite the lack of protection though, I will say I've ordered a number of Epiphones and other guitars as well, and the cardboard box usually protects them. The only neck break I've ever had was actually in a hard shell case. Now moving on up to the Epiphone Inspired by Gibson line, you've got a faux brown leather case with the Epiphone logo. We open it up and we notice it's got a nice vintage looking pink interior. It's not as plush and soft as you might think it would be, but I think it actually represents a real vintage case pretty good. Inside the compartment, you've got an ad for the Gibson app, the Epiphone lifetime warranty card, stickers, 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 stickers again, and lastly, a key for the case. For the Gibson USA model, you've got another faux leather brown case with the Gibson logo on it. Open it up and we've got a plush red interior. It's pretty soft. Inside the pocket, we've got the usual Gibson USA case candy, an owner's manual, the Gibson multi-tool, the warranty card, a strap, a Gibson polishing cloth, and an ad for the Gibson app, and lastly, keys to the case. Moving up to the custom shop model, we've got a black lift-in case without any logo, but there's a metal tag with the Gibson Custom Shop logo on the side, the little star Gibson thing. Inside the case, we've got a real soft yellow interior. Inside the pocket for this case, you've got a Gibson Custom Shop Certificate of Authenticity and a hardcover booklet. You've got a hang tag which basically tells you about the Gibson Historic Collection, an ad for the Gibson app, the warranty card for the Gibson Custom Shop, and some other hang tags which tell you various things about the purchase. There's also a waxy envelope in here which has some sort of historic reprinted documents for the would-be dealer of the 1960s, some info about the Murphy Lab, and a humbucker adjustment note. And lastly, of course, keys for the case. Now while we're on the subject, let's talk about lift-in, because I can't be the only person that's thinking, what is the story with them and why is Gibson always shoving them in my face when they include it in their products? Like for example, those 1959 pickups that came in this little bread loaf looking lift-in case that they bragged about. Well, I've done some digging around to get to the bottom of this, and to be honest, I've probably spent way too much time looking into this, which is why this review has taken me months to put together. No joke. Well, here's the short of it. Maurice Lifton, a Russian immigrant with a background in leather hide, forms the Lifton Manufacturing Company in 1918. They quickly gained prominence in the music accessories field, making leather goods such as bags for your sheet music, specialized cases for instruments, and lastly, briefcases. These were all widely regarded as some of the finest cases you could get at the time, and eventually they earned contracts with Martin Guitar, Gibson Guitar. They made cases for, I think it was around 70 years, 60 years, something like that, until Maurice suddenly died in 1971. I don't know if it was suddenly, I mean he was probably about 85, 90 years old by then. Anyway, Lifton shuts its doors. Now as musicians, I think it's a general but fair statement to say that we always kind of had this general preference for the old tried and true. But in my opinion, it wasn't really until the late 80s or early 90s where vintage really started to mean hyper collectible. Now if you read Norman Harris's great books, Confession of a Vintage Guitar Dealer, well, he goes all in detail, like astonishing detail about what he was paying for guitars up throughout the decades, and it's really interesting to see that, say, a Les Paul, 1959, he could get it for $2,000 in 1975. In 1982, then he's paying $6,000, and now what are they worth? About $250,000, something like that. So the price has really skyrocketed, and the point of all that is to say that it seems like everything that was kind of associated with that era has also skyrocketed as well. I mean, if you look at a genuine vintage Lifton case online right now, you're going to pay thousands of dollars for it. Is it any different than the case that they give you today? Well, not really, but it just has that allure to it. Fast forward to 2008, and this guy named Gary Walco with Banana Guitars in Florida picks up the trademark for Lifton. Well, this is where the story gets pretty interesting, because I don't know anything about Banana Guitars. I've never heard about them before I was doing this review and doing all this research and stuff, but I've read stories where people would post things on eBay and say, I've got this Lifton-like case, and Gary would hit them up with a cease and desist order and say, remove that or remove any reference of Lifton. And then I've read other stories about how Gibson owned trademarks to certain colors, so he couldn't make Lifton reproduction cases using those colors, and Now people have genuine lift-in cases from Banana Guitars that have wildly crazy interiors like purple white zebra stripes. I'm not really sure what to believe in regard to that. Now moving on with the story, as we all know, Gibson has a great marketing team. So in mid-2016, it looks like Gibson made some sort of deal with Gary Walco at Banana Guitars and purchased outright the trademarks for lift-in. And it seems like this was part of some bigger plan to have complete autonomy within their production line, because it was a few years later in 2021 that they also bought GWW, or General Woodworkers, a company that's been making guitar cases for 60-something years like that. Fast forward a couple years later, and Gibson makes this announcement. Today, Gibson is proud to unveil the latest in musical instrument gear and accessories with the luxury fine leather goods brand Lifton. The relationship between Gibson and Lifton was forged in leather and wood over a half-century ago. Now these two iconic brands come together to share an unshakable ethos of quality and craft for generations to come. So yes, it really is all just marketing. Gibson owns the guitar, the case making company, and the prestigious case name. It's just them marking up their own cases a couple $100 over the other cases that are probably made right next to them in the same factory. Four guitars, four different aesthetics. Sure, from a cursory glance, they pretty much look like the same guitar, other than the headstock, of course. But the more you look into it with a microscope, you start to see various things that are quite a bit different, actually. And I'll be honest with you, it wasn't until years and years later that I really started to pick up on this stuff, because I just never really was looking. An SG was an SG. But I'll say some of the most obvious things that I noticed between some of the guitars is, let's look at this Inspired by Gibson model versus this custom shop model. Or it doesn't even have to be the custom shop model. It could be the Inspired by Gibson model and the Gibson USA model. And first thing I see is the pick guard. What is going on with this pick guard? Look at how sharp these points are. I actually poked a hole in my skin when I was handling this thing, because it actually does come to a razor sharp point. I don't know why. It looks like other guitars online of the Inspired by Gibson line. I think that's a deliberate design choice for the 1961 Inspired by. But anyway, yes, you have your basic SG design. You've got your two chrome-covered pickups there. You've got your bridge and your stop bar, trapezoid inlay neck there. And something to note is that if you look online on Reverb, or you look throughout the books or any of that stuff at 1961, like actual 1961 Les Pauls, you'll see that not a lot of them have stop bars. In fact, I would say of the hundreds I looked at for this video, I maybe came across less than 10 that had stop bars. So it's very interesting that Gibson chose to make a stop bar model of the 1961 reissue and put a lot of time and effort into it. But I'll be honest, as a player, I'm much more happier with this than the sideways vibrola that the majority of the original 1961 releases had. Now, all four of these guitars feature a mahogany solid slab body. The difference is the custom shop is a one-piece slab for the body, whereas the Inspired by and the Gibson USA models have a two-piece body split right down the middle. And lastly, you've got the budget Epiphone, which is three pieces. And really the only way you can tell that is if you're looking on the edge here, you can see where the split is, because the face of it has a nice one-piece veneer, and that is the difference between this model versus the other three. Now, if you don't know what a veneer is, it's basically like you're taking a potato peeler to some wood and you're slicing a very thin slice of a really nice looking wood, but thin enough where you can make one piece of really good looking lumber, or just good quality lumber, extend it to maybe 20 guitars instead of just being one slab, one guitar. So it's a way of dressing up a budget guitar so you don't see a bunch of different slabs of wood, for example. I wouldn't go so far as saying it's putting lipstick on a pig, but it's a similar sort of concept. The two Gibson guitars have a nitrocellulose finish. The one on the custom shop, they call it a vintage patina. And indeed, you can see, when you look at it, it does have more of a film layer over it, whereas the Gibson USA model, it's more of a glossy nitrocellulose look. Now, when it gets to the Epiphone models, these are poly coatings, which are a little bit more durable than the nitrocellulose and probably will last longer and be more resistant to dings and nicks and things like that. The budget model has a gloss coating, whereas The Inspired By model has what they're calling a aged gloss. Now I gotta be honest with you, for me it doesn't really work that well. It reminds me a lot of the coating that they put on the Greenie model, where it actually kind of just looks, I don't know, looks plasticky. It doesn't look good. That's just my opinion, of course. If you like it, that's great. And before we get into body shape specifics, let's talk about the finishes. For the custom shop model, you're gonna get this finish and this finish alone, and this is pretty much called cherry red. Sort of a clear coat, you can see the grain through it, but it is a classic cherry color that you see on a lot of old Gibsons. When we get to the Gibson USA model, well, you get a whole host of options, actually more options than I think all the other three guitars combined. You get obviously this, which is TV yellow. Now, one misconception I think about TV yellow that I've heard from some of my friends and colleagues is they were disappointed when they saw that you could see the wood grain through the TV yellow. Now, that's kind of a mark of TV yellow, and it isn't really just a straight yellow paint. A lot of you probably already know that, but if you didn't know that, then don't be surprised when your TV yellow shows up and you can still see the wood grain through it. We've got translucent teal, we've got silver mist, we've got Palm blue, we've got cardinal red burst, we've got classic white, we've got cherry, and if you order from the Gibson website, there's an exclusive color option called ebony. Moving on down the line to the Epiphone Inspired By model, you've got two options. You've got this, which is the aged 60s cherry there, and you also get a aged classic white. For the budget Epiphone, we've got just vintage cherry, which is this model here. It's interesting to point out that these are both cherry finishes. This is the vintage cherry and this is the cherry red, which is obviously a little bit darker, quite a bit darker really than the Epiphone model. This is actually more like the candied cherry you'd get on top of your ice cream sundae, and this is more akin to like the Luxardo cherry that you'll find at the bottom of your cocktail. Talking more about the bodies, with more money comes more carving. You spend the least amount of money, you get the least amount of carving, as on the Epiphone model here. Now the Gibson Custom Shop has really sharp angles. I've probably played 20, 25 different SG models. I've never played a Custom Shop until this one arrived. And I gotta say, I was blown away by the carving on it. This has really sharp angles. For whatever reason, I'm not sure why Gibson rounds out all the angles on the SGs. Every single SG that I've had or have currently has rounded angles, but this thing actually has some really sharp angles to it. I mean, the evidence of that, I think, is this piece here on the back. And I know that that is a staple of the 1961 design, but I'm more used to what you would see on, say, like the Gibson USA model, where you still have a similar line, but it's so rounded out that you don't get that distinct shaping. Now, as we move down the line towards the more budget-friendly models, you get to the Epiphone model, and the Epiphone model also has a very similar, but you can see it's so soft, that same sort of cut right there. The budget Epiphone's like a SG Special. It's pretty much just flat. There's actually nothing on it at all. Now let's take a look at the beveling between the front side and the back side where the waist is here on the guitar. Now if we start with the budget model, you can see that it's a little bit around a 3/4 of an inch thickness there. Now we move on to the Inspired By and the Gibson USA model, and you can see it's around a 1/2 inch of thickness there. And then lastly we move to the Custom Shop, and you're measuring just over 1/4 of an inch right there. That's quite a bit of a different thing. Now, I think for the majority of guitar players, that probably doesn't really matter that much, but for me, that's what I love. I love the attention to detail right there. Now, other things that set some of these models apart is the top 3 tier models, which would be the Inspired By, the Gibson USA, and the Gibson Custom Shop. You've got this bevel here that kind of follows the pick guard pretty good, and it ends right about here where the pick guard cuts off there. Now, when we go over to the budget model, for whatever reason, it stops significantly short of that. It's like whoever was carving it was like, yeah, that's good enough. And you find a similar sort of difference in that carving on the back side here. When you follow this upper carve or bevel, it comes around the side of the guitar and it just sort of stops right here. And it's like that on the Inspired By model, it just stops right here. When we move over to the Gibson USA model, again, it stops right here, which is about 6 inches from the strap button. But then when we get to the custom shop model, this carve extends all the way to almost to the strap button. It comes all the way up to about, I'd say, 1/2 inch short of that, which is just a more extreme version of the carving, and I have to believe that it's more accurate. Let's talk about the horns, because the horns are probably the most defining feature of the SG guitar body, at least to me. And all 4 of these guitars have different style horns. So when we look at the Inspired By model, it has the thickest sort of flat spot where all the surfaces converge at the tips of the horns. And what I mean by that is, if you were to look at this from this angle, this piece right here is about 1 inch and 1/8 of thickness across the top side of the horns. Now that is not a unique feature just to these Epiphones. For example, the Gibson Voodoo guitar that I talked about earlier has almost the same sort of carving. And what that is kind of more of just a later style of the SG body. Probably something to save money and save time. You get something very similar on the budget Epiphone model, which is not quite as wide as the Inspired By, but it is almost around 1 inch there. And you can see it when you're looking at it from the top. You're like, it's not really much of a horn in the sense that it doesn't come to a point. Maybe from the face, it looks like a profile of a horn though. And we move on to the Gibson USA model, and it's a little bit better. You've got a little bit more beveling in this area, which narrows that space as opposed to just getting flat here, which is what's going on with the Epiphones. So on the Gibson, you've got about a 5/8 inch of flat space there where all the angles come together, which is looking more and more like a horn. But the most you get is on the custom shop, where you get the most amount of beveling in this area and on the front side. And the point is really just about 1/2 inch of flat space there. So it does look the most like a horn from every single angle, if that matters to you. I know some people are like, yeah, get on with it. Now when it comes to the early model neck joints on these guitars, well, let's just say you could put together a really thick coffee table book showcasing all the different designs. So what happened is Gibson developed this guitar and they gave it to their factory workers to try out, people that played guitar. Not really any real world demoing or prototyping of it, at least that I'm aware of. But once they did start shipping these guitars out, and you had hobbyists and you had people like me playing them and you had rock stars playing them, and basically everyone under the sun is playing these guitars and subjecting them to what they're normally used to with their other guitars at the time, which would have been Stratocasters and Les Pauls. And that's when the problems started to creep in. The necks started to snap and break. And so Gibson basically went to the drawing board over and over and over again to come up with different technical designs to figure out how to get this neck to stay in. So I think it's interesting that the model that the custom shop based this guitar off of had what's known here as a lip. You can see this neck line here, but then you'll notice this little jut. Well, that is actually part of the body, and it's a tiny lip. It's got to be about 1/10 of an inch thick that sticks up about 1/4 of an inch, and the neck just sort of rests on it. And I'll show you a close-up here. It's a very unique feature that I've seen on some other actual 1961 Les Pauls, 62s even. It's more common, but it's completely different than the other models here. None of them need it because all the other ones are using different materials to make their guitars, and that's something that I'll talk about in a little bit, is the glue that forms this custom shop versus the glue that's used on the other models. All of these guitars, Gibson and Epiphone, have a mahogany neck, as expected. And they're all listed as having slim taper necks, but there's a little bit of difference there as well. The custom shop model here says that it has a 60 slim taper neck. The Inspired By model says that it has a slim taper C, and the budget Epiphone and the Gibson USA model just say slim taper. So why all the variation? Well, I don't know. Let's get into the measurements and see. For the custom shop model here, we get a 0.82 on the 1st fret, and we get a 0.91 at the 12th fret. For the Gibson USA model, we get a 0.80 at the 1st fret and a 0.91 at the 12th fret. For the Epiphone Inspired By model, we get a 0.78 at the 1st fret and a 0.87 at the 12th fret. And lastly, for the budget Epiphone, we get a 0.78 at the 1st fret and a 0.85 at the 12th fret. So they're all relatively close, but they're not quite exact, which is to be expected. Now when we come to measure the nut, they're relatively close, with both the budget model and the custom shop coming in at a 1.68. We move on to the Inspired By Gibson, and it's a hair thicker at 1.69 at the nut here. And lastly, for the Gibson USA model, it's a bit thicker again at 1.71 inches. All guitars did measure 12-inch radiuses across the fretboard. The only difference is that on the budget model here, there's a little bit of flattening between the D and the A strings around the 1st to 5th fret, but it was negligible. I don't think anybody would ever notice that. Now, where things do differ is on the fretboard materials. The two Epiphone guitars have laurel fretboards, and the two Gibson guitars have Indian rosewood fretboards. Now, just in case you didn't know, but this is something that's come up in the comments section quite a bit, is rosewood and why is it called rosewood. And it's actually not because of the color. Even though sometimes you will find rosewood that has a pinkish hue to it, you can see that on this custom shop model it is very dark. Not quite ebony, but it's close. The reason it's called rosewood is because when they cut down the trees, it has a very sweet smell that's reminiscent of roses. And they say that Brazilian rosewood is even more sweeter of the two, Brazilian and Indian. The more you know. One more difference is the profile of these necks. They all say slim taper, but the Gibsons have a bit more of a shallower edge here where your fingers go around the underside of the neck over to the fretting. When it comes to the tenons on these guitars, well, I'm kind of on the fence of how to refer to it because they kind of all have technically long tenons in the sense that the mortise and tenon extends to underneath the neck pickup here, which if you were to look at a side profile like this right here, of a Les Paul, you can see that the short tenons do not do that and the long tenons do. But the difference there is on the Les Paul, you've got several inches of body that the neck is resting on, whereas on the 61 SG at least, the neck connects at the very last possible fret. So really there is nothing for it to rest on except for underneath the first pickup there. Maybe they're just appropriate tenons. Maybe that's a good way to put it. Regardless of the mortise and tenon talk with all four of these guitars, they all have the same general bit of construction and dimensions. Now let's talk about neck angles, because there's a bit of difference here as well. The two Epiphone guitars have a neck back angle of about 3.8 degrees from a flat body. For the Gibson USA model, that neck angle is a bit shallower at about 3.3 degrees. And lastly, the custom shop angle is the shallowest of all at about 2.2 degrees, making the neck noticeably flatter to the body than what you would find on one of the Epiphone guitars here. Now generally you will get a little bit of difference in the way the neck is mounted on these guitars, but the custom shop model is deliberately flatter than the other models to be a more true historic design. Now check out this side profile graph. On the very left is a 1960 Les Paul prototype listed for sale on the Gibson website. It belongs to Gibson CEO Cesar Goikin. It's an actual guitar from the era. Now here's the custom shop Les Paul, the one I'm holding here in my hands, and here's the Gibson USA 61. You can see the angle getting steeper. Now let's introduce the Epiphone models. The angle is steeper still. And lastly, just for those inquiring, here is the current Gibson SG Standard model, not a 1961. You can see the angle is even steeper still. And that's because those measurements are closer to about 4.5 degrees angle back. Now I suspect to the SG superfan this is not new information, but perhaps for those of you that are less familiar, you've gone to your Guitar Center or local guitar store and you've played the different SGs and you can feel that they're different, but they look so similar. Well, you know what they say, the red devil is in the details. And the last bit of information regarding the necks, the headstock angle versus the neck. So on the two Gibson guitars, the headstock angles back at 17.5 degrees, and on the Epiphones, it angles back at 14 degrees, which is pretty standard for all Gibsons and all Epiphones. The exception being the Gibson-made USA Epiphones, like the recently reviewed Coronet, which you can check out right here. All right, let's start at the bottom of the guitar, and we'll work our way up the front, and then we'll flip it around and look at the back side. Now, on both of these Epiphone guitars, the strap buttons have what I refer to as the flower pot style. That's because it sits like that and it looks like a flower pot to me. Anyway, this strap button really has no place in this vintage realm that these guitars live in. These probably have been on Epiphone guitars for maybe the past 20, 25 years, but they don't look anything like vintage buttons as far as I'm concerned. Now, when we move to the Gibson USA model, this is a bit closer in that the styling represents the strap button of the 60s, but it's obviously been fattened to better accommodate straps and safety, safety being like your guitar falling off and landing on the floor. The most truest one, of course, is going to be the Gibson Custom Shop model, which is very tiny, and to be honest with you, I wouldn't trust it one bit. It's less than 3/4 of the width of any of the other strap buttons. Real quickly, I want to point out that of these four guitars, the Custom Shop model is the only one that has the knob pointers. Now, I really love these. I understand they're not that hard to install, but for whatever reason, I never do. I never put them on. Yeah, I love them. I wish they all had them. Every guitar ever made. Now next up from there we jump to the stop bar and the bridge here. Both Epiphone guitars have what Epiphone calls the
lock tone technology.
Now if you're not familiar with the lock tone technology, what it is there's basically some sort of clips inside the mounting areas of both of these two pieces, and it helps them snap onto the post sticking out of the body there. Now Epiphone had these two things to say about
lock tone technology.
And I'm paraphrasing here a bit, but during string changes, when and if all the strings are removed, both the tune-o-matic and the stop bar can often fall off their anchor bolts. This can result in a wide range of minor problems ranging from the disappearing under a road case to being put back on incorrectly. There needed to be a way to lock both the tune-o-matic and the stop bar on their posts, ideally without the need for tools. And after conducting sustained tests, it was determined that the tighter the fit of the tune-o-matic and stop bar on their posts, and hence the greater surface area contact, the longer the sustain and the better the tone. So it's a two-part system. Both safety, so you don't lose it under a road case, and when the 200 pounds of string tension that are pulling this bar up and these tuning pegs this way isn't enough to maintain contact.
Lock tone.
And I always just thought the second point there was silly. Now moving on to the Gibson side of things here, well, the Gibson USA guitar has an advanced plating stop bar and a Gibson ABR1 branded modern ABR1 bridge. For the custom shop, you've got a also Gibson branded ABR1 bridge and an unbranded stop bar. None of these guitars have any
lock tone technology.
Something I do want to point out, and it's a minor detail, is how different these stop bars are from each other. Now the two Epiphones use the exact same identical stop bar. The Gibson USA model is a bit different than those, and lastly the custom shop model, the sides or the hooks on the stop bar have a different shape to them than the Gibson USA or the Epiphone models, in that they have sort of like an angle point in them. Now let's also talk about the custom shop's ABR1 bridge, which has a different sort of more cigar shape to both the Epiphone and the Gibson USA model's more pill-shaped bridge. You can see it has a longer taper towards the post holes there. And another difference between the two Gibson offerings versus the two Epiphone offerings is the clip there for the intonation screws. Now the screws on both the Gibson USA and the custom shop model you could just pop out with your thumb like that. Whereas the Epiphone ones here have a spring clip so that you don't accidentally lose them under a road case or something. Now going back to the modern versus historic ABR1 bridges, well, it goes without saying that the Epiphone guitars and the Gibson USA model have what's called the modern ABR1 bridge. Now what that means is that there's actually metal studs in the bodies of these guitars, and the post and thumb wheels are one solid piece that screw into these. Now what this does is it's a stronger system that's easier to adjust, and it's less likely to bend under the string tension. So for example, you could loosen these strings just a little bit, and in the case of Gibson, you could put a hex wrench in there and adjust the post height. And in the case of the Epiphone, it would be a flathead screwdriver. If, say, your thumbs weren't enough to move it on their own, which often, under string tension can be a little tough. Now, when it comes to the custom shop model, which has the historic ABR1 bridge, well, the system is quite a bit different. What it is a threaded post that is sent right down directly into the body. And on top of that sits a thumb wheel, which is independent of that threaded post. And then the ABR1 sits right on top of that. So you have to adjust it with the thumb wheel. Now, the obvious downside to this system is that occasionally, if you have to have your bridge up higher, over time the tension starts to bend the posts, as you can see in this image here. Now, I think it's probably pretty unlikely on this model, as everything is very low, and from what I've seen, it's more of a common thing on Les Pauls and other guitars where these components generally sit a little bit higher, but it's certainly not outside the realm of possibility. Now, something else I want to point out is that all the components on the Gibson USA and the two Epiphone models are brand new, and they look brand new. And that's different from the custom shop model, where everything has a specific patina to it by design, really. It's not like they left this guitar outside for a couple months and then shipped it out because now it looks old. No, they do that on purpose to just make it look like a vintage guitar. Now I can handle that sort of aging to it. In fact, I think it can look kind of cool. Like for example, these screws, you can see those are pretty cool. But when people are spending like $10,000 on a guitar that has nicks in it and paint chips and there's little knobs that are broken off, and there's finish checking. Well, you can check me right out of that club, because for me, that is a bridge too far. So moving on to the neck here, well, both of the Epiphone guitars and the Gibson USA models have what they call medium jumbo frets. That doesn't surprise me or you either, I'm sure, as that's pretty much standard on almost all Epiphones and Gibsons these days. But when you get to the custom shop model, they call these authentic medium jumbo frets. So what does that mean exactly? The vintage medium jumbo frets are a tiny bit thicker, coming in at just about 1/10 of an inch thickness versus 0.9 or 0.85 inches. And then additionally, the custom shop frets are quite a bit lower to the fretboard than what you would see on the Gibson USA or the two Epiphone models here. So yes, for this guitar, the custom shop uses fret wire that could more accurately represent medium jumbo. And that means that these frets are, yes, slightly wider, they're shorter, they're a bit fatter in shape, and they're more like a D shape as opposed to a rounded off V. Moving on from there, we get to the truss rods. Now, both the Epiphones have the signature dual action Epiphone truss rod there, which means you're going to need a hex wrench or some sort of Allen key to adjust that. That's pretty common with almost all Epiphones these days that I've seen anyway. Now, both the Gibsons have a traditional Gibson single action truss rod, and those are hex nuts on there, so you would need a hex socket to adjust those. The difference between the custom shop model and the other three models, though, is the custom shop has what Gibson calls the 1950s no tube truss rod. Now, maybe you've heard that term before, maybe you haven't, maybe you're like me, I had no idea what it was, and I did probably way too much research into this. But again, I still don't have the highest confidence that this is accurate, so please, if you know something else, let me know in the comments. I'll try and explain it anyway. As far as I understand it, when they're building the necks and they have the channel running down it for the truss rod, you stick the truss rod in, and there's a tiny piece of wood that gets laid over the top of that, so the top side of the neck is flat, that you can then glue the fretboard to. Well, you have to glue in that tiny strip, which is called a fillet, and they would use hide glue back in the day. Now, hide glue has whatever the chemical process is, it really works with the porous wood to bond it together, but once it reacts with the metal, the bond isn't so strong, and if, say, you were to adjust the truss rod, it had a tendency to just shatter and not really form that well of a bond between them. So it wasn't really an issue. And then later on, when they moved on to tight bond to glue in these pieces, well, that was a different chemical compound altogether, and that actually would bond to the truss rods. So it would make adjustments very difficult. So I hear that's where this tube comes into play, is the truss rod is inserted into a tube, or what's affectionately known as a condom if you look online. And if any of the tight bond were to seep past the fillet or lock onto whatever this tube is, the tube might hold steady, but the truss rod would twist in the tube, and therefore you could still adjust your guitar. That's what I think is the accurate story with that. But, another thing I've heard is that the truss rods back then would rattle around inside that little channel, and it would cause some sort of resonance, and that's why they put the tube on. And I honestly, I searched for like an hour to see if the tube is still there, and I couldn't find any photos of like a neck snapped clean in half to see if the tube was there, or maybe somebody building it. Honestly, I couldn't find anything. I searched the StewMac site for tubes and stuff, couldn't find anything. And then the comments online are like, no, bro, we don't do tubes anymore. Tubes are so 1980s. But then what is there now? So I don't know. I think there must be something there, because Gibson is still saying like 1950s no tube design. Well, is that the same as like a 2010s no tube design? I don't really know what to believe anymore. If you know for sure, please let me know in the comments, because I'm very curious. One more thing that I want to point out is the acorn nuts on these guitars. So the Gibson USA model has a modern acorn nut, and this is such a tiny detail that I love about the custom shop model is you can see it's a different acorn nut with the longer sidewalls there. It's just different enough, but it's such a tiny detail to really pay attention to that makes me appreciate the custom shop more and more. I'll be honest, I have a custom shop Les Paul, but I've never actually done this much of a deep dive into it, so I'm really curious maybe one day to compare that and see. Now lastly, let's look at the tuning machines on these guitars. The Epiphones both use the exact same version of a Epiphone branded Kluson style tuner. The Gibson USA model is very similar. It's a Gibson branded Kluson style tuner, but it's actually a little bit more boxy and squared off. And truth be told, the Epiphone models are quite a bit similar looking to the vintage ones than the Gibson USA model. And the most accurate, of course, is going to be the Gibson Custom Shop model, which has the small hole, and then it's also known as the single line, and these are the actual Kluson branded tuners here. There's actually a fascinating website I stumbled across that talks about all the different Kluson style tuners and the different changes over the years, and it was much more of an interesting read than I would have expected. And yeah, I'll put a link to that below. But anyway, let's talk about the tuning ratios here. So both of the Epiphone guitars have an 18:1 tuning ratio, which gives them a great fine-tuning adjustability, and honestly, I think those are great. I love them. When it comes to the Gibson USA model, it's back to the more traditional Gibson 14:1 ratio, which is not quite as accurate, but it works just fine as well. And then lastly, we get to the Gibson Custom Shop model, which has a vintage accurate 15:1 ratio, and you can still buy these tuners today if you like them. This is the part of the video that's going to be very interesting because each of these guitars have different pickups, different capacitors, different wiring for some of them. I think this is going to be the most evident in the sound test of the actual true differences between all these guitars, even more than how they look or whatever feature sets they have here. Let's start with the budget Epiphone here. For the neck pickup, we've got Epiphone's Pro Bucker 2 pickup, and sliding down here to the bridge, we've got Epiphone's Pro Bucker 3 pickup. Now these pickups have Alnico 2 magnets and are vacuum wax potted. Now I actually read a really detailed forum post that had graphs and sonic comparisons and frequency, or they purported anyway, that the Pro Buckers are just repackaged Gibson 57 pickups. And I'll be honest with you, after reading it, I was pretty convinced as well. I'll put a link for it below. Now for the readings on these pickups, for the bridge I'm getting an 8.46, and for the neck I'm getting a 7.77. When I put them in the middle, I'm getting a 4.05. Now flipping the guitar over and looking in the cavity here, we've got some CTS linear taper pots. They're all 500K. We've also got some non-descriptor Mylar 22 microfarad caps for both the tone knobs. And we've also got a lot of excess wiring in Epiphone's quick connects. It's hard to tell, but this guitar's wiring is what's known as the more modern wiring configuration. Now moving on to the Inspired by Gibson Epiphone 61 guitar, we've actually got Gibson Burstbucker 2 pickups here in the neck, and that's supposed to be like a medium wound pickup. And then moving down from there, we've got a Burstbucker 3 pickup inside the bridge here, which is a overwound hotter pickup. Both these pickups are Alnico 2 magnets, and they are not wax potted. Now, what they say about Burstbuckers is that the coils are mismatched on purpose to better represent the infamous PAF pickup of yesteryear. Now for these pickups, I'm reading an 8.38 in the bridge, and the neck is a 7.99. And right here in the middle, I'm getting a 4.09. Now let's flip it over and look in the cavity here. So inside here, we've got more 500K CTS linear pots, and there are also two 22 microfarad polyester Mallory capacitors. Now, unlike the budget Epiphone, this guitar has the more period accurate 50s wiring style. Now the Gibson USA 61 has a 60s Burstbucker rhythm in the neck, and in the bridge it has a 60s Burstbucker lead. Now, unlike the previous two guitars, these pickups are Alnico 5 magnets. These coils are also mismatched to better represent the PAF pickups, and these are not wax potted. Now, I did look online to see if there was a difference between a rhythm and a lead 60s Burstbucker, and I couldn't really find anything, and to be honest with you, the readings sort of indicate that much as well. In the bridge, I'm getting a 7.71 reading, and the neck is actually a tiny bit hotter at a 7.78. Stuck in the middle, I'm getting a 3.87 reading. So that's a little bit different. You don't usually read about neck pickups being hotter than the bridge unless it's intentional, and I don't really know if that's the case here. I think it's actually just variance in the way that they're made. But if you have one of these guitars and you'd like to take a measurement and let me know what it is, I'm curious how your neck versus your bridge pickup reads as well. Now flipping it over, we can see in the cavity here that Gibson has a set of 500K audio taper potentiometers, which is different than the Epiphones, and then 22 microfarad polyester orange drop capacitors. Interestingly, this guitar has the modern wiring configuration. Now moving on to the custom shop model, this guitar features a custom shop pickup in the neck and a custom shop pickup in the bridge, and both complete with patent applied for stickers for extra cheese. Now both of these pickups are Alnico 3 magnets, which makes it different than the previous guitars before it, and these are also unpotted. Now the readings on these pickups, I'm getting a 7.9 in the bridge and a 7.83 for the neck. In the middle position, I'm getting a 3.93. Now let's pop this thing over and look inside the cavity here. And I'm seeing we've got CTS 500K audio taper pots again. So different that the Gibsons are using audio taper and the Epiphones are using linear taper. And let's see, I've got Sprague 22 microfarad Black Beauty capacitors. And this custom shop is vintage wired. So 4 guitars, 4 different types of pickups, 3 different types of magnets, different capacitors for each one, different wiring styles for each kind. There's a lot going on there, and again, when we get to the sound test, you'll be able to hear that. But I will put a couple links below for some very interesting comparisons of similar circuits, but with different capacitors. I think it was Premier Guitar did a really cool write-up with some audio samples that took basically one system and then they changed it out for 5 or 6 different capacitors just to see how that would affect it as the tone was fully on, fully rolled off, and it was actually kind of an interesting thing. And then I'll also put a link, if I can find one, for the difference between 50s and modern wiring, because it's very similar, but it's different in the way that the pots react with the volume and the tone. It's sort of like you're finding a balance between, do you want the volume to raise when you adjust the tone, or do you want the tone to change as you adjust the volume? And it's a sort of thing that I don't really understand completely how it interacts, but it is fascinating to read about. Let's just start at the bottom of the guitars and we'll work our way up to the top and then flip it around just like we did with hardware. Now the very first thing I want to point out, and I realize it's a little bit silly, is that on the 2 Epiphone guitars, there's a tiny bit of felt there between the strap button and the body. Now that feature is absent on the Gibson guitars. Moving on from there, we get to the knobs. All 4 of these guitars have black top hat knobs with silver disc inserts that either say volume or tone. Now as far as I can tell, the Gibson USA and the 2 Epiphone models use the exact same black top hat knob, but the custom shop model is a little bit different in that the knobs seem to sit better over the post and conceal the tightening nut there better than on the other guitars, where that nut is a little bit more exposed. Now it's not really a big deal, but just for clarity, you can see how the knobs are a little bit higher or a little bit raised above the body there. Now just up from there we get to the poker chip. Now all these guitars have a black poker chip with gold writing on it. The difference is that the custom shops uses a more historic plastic that's known as cellulose acetate butyrate. Each of these guitars also has an identical cream tip. And then we move on to the pick guards, and not one of these pick guards is the exact same. So let's first start here with the budget model. Now this pick guard is so thick that it's actually raising above the pickup ring here, so you won't really ever feel it when you're playing, but just aesthetically you look at it and you're like, why is that sticking up above the pickup ring? That's unusual. When we move to the Inspired by Gibson model here, it's pointy for reasons I don't really understand. It's very pointy and sharp. It's a very interesting quirk. For the Gibson USA model, the pick guard is just slightly wider than any other pick guard that I've got here. You might even be able to tell just from looking at it. It's strangely bigger. I don't know why. Also, the spacing here between the 2 pickups is a little bit different. And lastly, when we get to the Gibson custom shop model, it most accurately follows the contours of the body. I don't know what's going on with the Gibson USA model. Seems like they were just freehanding it, and they probably were. They probably made it, put it in a stack, and then somebody grabbed it and stuck it on the guitar, and that's probably where that ends. But this one's really nice in that it kind of follows the actual contour of the body. Again, that's a little small detail, but it adds up in the end, right? And another thing is the actual look of the custom shop pickguard has like it's been polished or used and worn over time. So it has this really smooth look to it. Whereas when you look at most pickguards on most new guitars, you can see that they've got like a machining jut in them where it cuts it out. And it's nice to not have that on here. Another thing that I want to point out is underneath the pickguard for the budget Epiphone, never been a fan of misdrilled holes in my guitar. Doesn't affect the playability, does it? Now moving on to the pickup rings of these guitars. Well, all 4 of these guitars have black pickup rings, of course. The Gibson USA model and the 2 Epiphones have black plastic pickup rings. The custom shop model also has plastic ones, but Gibson goes so far as to say that these are M69 cellulose acetate butyrate rings. Okay, I'll be honest with you about all this cellulose acetate butyrate stuff. You could have fooled me. According to Gibson and other sources, it is softer, feels like the real thing, and most importantly has the correct smell of vintage plastic. Indeed, it does smell different. One thing I do want to point out about the custom shop model versus the Gibson USA model or the Epiphone models is that the pickup rings actually sit quite a bit higher than the other guitars, almost 1/10 of an inch. And I'm assuming that just has something to do with the historic construction of the model. So next we move on to this little piece of plastic here between the upper pickup ring and the fretboard. And I'll be honest, I've always wondered what that was for. And when I took it off of the custom shop here and I was looking at it, I was like, oh, it's actually kind of nice looking there. You get to see like some of the really good craftsmanship. Then I took it off of this Gibson USA model, and yeah, so that's what that's there for. Now moving on to the neck, these guitars all have a cream binding, as it's called, but they're not all equal. For example, Epiphone always uses this off cream color, which to my eye has a little bit of a green hue to it. I don't know if that's supposed to look aged or if that's just their product that they use. When I look at the one on the Gibson USA model, that's kind of more of what I'm expecting and what I've seen on other guitars that use some sort of binding. It's more of a pure cream color, almost like a eggnog kind of color. That's what I like. I think it looks great. And then when we get to the custom shop model here, it's similar to what's on the Epiphone, but it has more of this orange hue to it. Kind of like when you've seen older guitars, it's just made to look more vintage. Then we talk about the side markers on the fretboards. Well, both the Epiphones and the Gibson USA have these black fret markers on the side there, whereas on the custom shop model, they're actually supposed to mimic the tortoise shell of old guitars there. And so that's what they've got. There's little pieces of celluloid or something like that inside there that sort of mimic that look. So now let's talk about the inlays. So both of the Epiphone guitars have pearloid trapezoid inlays. The Gibson USA model has an acrylic trapezoid inlay. The custom shop has a cellulose nitrate inlay, basically nitrocellulose. It's differing hardnesses of a mother of pearl-like plastic. Now moving up the neck, we get eventually to the nut. And both of the Epiphone guitars and the Gibson USA model have a Graphtec nut, whereas on the Gibson Custom Shop model, you get a nylon nut. Now we get to the truss rod covers. Now all the truss rod covers are 2-ply white black. The Gibson USA model and the budget Epiphone just have blank truss rod covers, as you can see there. But then if I take the Custom Shop model and the Inspired By model, you can see they both have Les Paul written there, which is obviously a historically accurate nod to the guitar, as it was the Les Paul originally in 1961. And as to be expected, the Epiphone models have 3 screws, whereas the Gibson models both have 2 screws. Now just up from there we get to the inlay in the neck, and both of the Epiphones have an identical crown inlay. It's a silver pearlescent look to it, and I'm sure it's the exact same one in both guitars. The Gibson USA model is similar to the Epiphone, but it is a bit different. As you can see there, it still has the same sort of silver pearlescence, but the prong spacing is a little bit different. Now the Gibson Custom Shop model, it has a bit more of a goldish hue to it, and it's different than the other 2 that I've already shown you. And then we get to the logos of the guitars. Now both of the Epiphones have an identical silver pearlescent water slide decal right there. And then the Gibson USA model has a familiar Gibson decal. I think that is a water slide as well. And now lastly, the Gibson Custom Shop logo you can see is that gold pearlescence to it. And I think this might actually be real mother of pearl just based on the shape of it on close inspection, but I can't be for certain. Now one thing I do want to point out is on the back side of these guitars, this would be the Inspired by Gibson Epiphone and the Custom Shop, you get the vintage accurate double ring keystone tuners. That's a real nice touch, and it's something that differentiates both of these guitars from the budget model as well as the Gibson USA model, which both just have the single ring Kluson keystone shape there. Now something else I want to point out is we slide down here to the bottom where the cavity covers are, and all 4 of these guitars have the traditional SG shape there. That's the budget, the Custom Shop, the Gibson USA, and the Inspired by Gibson Epiphone. But the difference is the Inspired by Gibson model says Epiphone and Gibson Custom Shop there. But that's not really where it ends for this guitar. When you take the cavity off and you look on the backside, it says, "Nice work, Larry," a reference to Larry Allers, the unsung hero Gibson, who they think is largely responsible for the actual design of the SG, maybe more so than Ted McCarty. Now all these guitars feel distinctly like SGs, and that's obviously not a surprise, but if you're coming from the world of, say, like a Fender Strat, then this can take a little bit to get used to, and that's because the way that the guitar actually sits, the strap button is almost right behind the neck pickup, and as a result, everything is kind of shifted over. Now, additionally, when you're sitting, your knee is located right underneath the bridge pickup, which is also a little bit different. Take, for example, the Strat here. Now, the Strat is a little bit different. Your knee is going to sit right underneath the middle pickup there, and then your strap button is located so far away from your neck pickup that it actually just rests in a little bit of a different spot than on an SG. And you kind of find the same thing when you're dealing with a Les Paul, same exact sort of concept where the strap button is located farther out from the neck pickup and your knee, if you were sitting, is located between the two pickups. So I think it's easier to shift from a Strat to a Les Paul when you're playing than playing with an SG, for example. Now, the only real outlier amongst all these SGs to me is the custom shop, and that's mostly because the neck angle is so flat to the body that you're actually a little bit more extended with your arm out when you're at the farther ends of the fretboard. Now, for me, I actually kind of prefer that just because the way that my body is built, it sits a little bit different on me, and I find it kind of uncomfortable to have your elbow back while you're fretting than forward. I would rather have it out farther, but that's going to be different for every player, and I think they obviously wouldn't have changed it if the majority didn't want it to be a little bit different, right? Another thing of note is that the Gibson USA model and the budget Epiphone actually have slightly wider fretboards as you get down here towards the end of the fretboard, by about 1/10 of an inch, which you can actually really feel it if you're playing them. And I prefer the thinner models like the Inspired By and the Gibson Custom Shop personally. Now, another thing about the feel of this guitar is the weights. And then let's start with the weight on the budget Epiphone model. This guitar comes in at about 6.68 pounds or just about 6 pounds 11 ounces. For the Inspired By model here, this comes in at about 6.72 pounds, almost the same, or it's about 6 pounds and 11.5 ounces. For the Gibson USA model, this comes in at about 6.34 pounds, or 6 pounds and 5.5 ounces, making this the lightest of the bunch. And lastly, the Custom Shop is 6.75 pounds, or 6 pounds and 12 ounces, making this one the heaviest of the bunch. So now I'm going to do a general sound test. So we've got 4 guitars, 4 different pickup options, 4 different types of capacitors. We've got 2 different wiring schemes. We've got different lumbers for the fretboards. We've got 1-piece bodies versus 2-piece bodies, 3-piece bodies. Long story short, it's going to be a different sound for each one. We already know that. So I'm going to go over through a couple styles and you can just listen and see what you think about it. It's going to be like a mega mix where I'm doing one song and then I'll just switch the guitar. The song stays the same, but the tone will change with the guitars. You'll see what I mean. A couple more things. I did do a neck dive test on each guitar just to see how they performed, and they're all pretty similar with the exception of the Gibson USA model had a little bit more neck dive than the others because it's the lightest of the bunch. I did use the same strap for each test. This is a 2.5-inch Gibson strap. Nothing special. There's no padding. There's no like grip on it. It's just like fake leather, which I think is probably pretty representative of the average strap that most people have. I've spent some time and I've adjusted all these guitars so that they play the way I like them to play. I've also put on a set of my custom string joy strings, not a sponsor, but in case you're curious, these are 9/5, 11/5, 16, 24, 34, 44 strings. It's something I've used for a few years now, and I'm just used to the way they play and the way that they react. I've also decided to use a brand new Gibson medium wedge pick on each guitar just to keep that consistent. And lastly, I have programmed all the effects with automation in PreSonus Studio One so that they're consistent between tracks between the different guitars. So I don't have the reverb dialed up a little bit more or anything extra, just to keep it consistent. So the only thing that I'm actually adjusting on the guitars is the pickup selector and then where the knobs are. All right, let's get into it. Anyway, guys, that was the sound test. Obviously, the cleaner the sound, the more of the true nature of the guitar gets to show, whereas the dirtier it is, it's more like the effects roadshow, right? But I did want to demonstrate that so you had a general idea of how they sound across the entire spectrum there. That is my review of these four beasts. The custom shop model, the fretwork is impeccable. The attention to every single detail is just marvelous, I thought. It's obviously more of a statement piece than a performing guitar, because all these other guitars perform just as well, more or less. But you know, if you really want something that just reminds you of the old 1961 Les Paul, this is the guitar you're going to get. I'd say my only gripe, and it's the silliest thing, but I was thinking about this the other day, is when I took off the pick guard, it would have been really cool if it was like a brighter shade of cherry underneath there where it hadn't been like so sun-worn, but maybe that's better saved for like the Murphy Lab or something. I don't know if you can get just that option on a Murphy Lab without it having like a 3-inch gouge in it. I don't know. The chart for what's included is kind of vague to me. But I will say this about the custom shop model. It was a little bit thinner sounding than the other guitars. I think the Gibson USA Standard 61 is probably the best all-around guitar here. The 60s burst bucker pickups are some of the best pickups Gibson's making these days in my opinion, and I think they're the most versatile when it comes to reaching into different styles and pulling something out of it, which I don't think you get from the other pickups here. Also, the styling is really close to the 61, which is a point in my book. Now, if you want a more affordable guitar that has some upgraded electronics and styling that's reminiscent of the traditional 61 styling, and also half the price of the Gibson USA model, then you can't really beat the Inspired by Gibson Epiphone SG 61. It's a great guitar, it plays great. My only gripe with it is this finish. I just can't get behind this finish. I don't know why, it just looks plasticky to me, but for $950, it's a pretty great guitar. Lastly, if you want a pretty decent SG for not very much money, well, the Epiphone 61 is pretty good. And I'll be honest with you, I found myself playing this guitar and the custom shop the most because they both played really good straight out of the case, or the box in this manner. And that would be my one complaint about this guitar, is not having at least a gig bag. And I guess I don't think the sound is as good as the other guitars. And that has nothing to do with the price. It's just the Pro Buckers, I didn't think it was on the same spectrum as the other guitars. Maybe for a different style, it would be awesome. But if a budding guitarist was like, hey, what do you think of this guitar? Do you think it's a good starter? I'd be like, yeah, of course, this is a great guitar, especially for that price, $550. All right, guys, that concludes the Almost Ultimate 61 Les Paul Deep Dive video. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. I don't think I will make a 4-guitar deep dive video for quite some time now, but if you did happen to like it, please consider clicking the like button or maybe subscribing. I always appreciate that. If you have any comments, leave them below, and if I have anything relevant to say, I will do so. All right, next time.